boatman widening the creek bed behind St. Matthews in rural Iowa struck something soft among the roots. A smell came first, sharp and sweet, something that cut through the diesel exhaust of their shovels. Then the metal edge found cloth. It gave a dry tear. Beneath the mud, what they thought was a buried sack split open like an overripe fruit. Inside lay the small things that survive time better than flesh. A row of tin buttons, a child's scuffed shoe, a rosary whose Hail Mary beads had blackened with the years, and when the county coroner knelt by the hole and brushed away the loam, his gloves snagged on splintered bone no larger than his pinky finger. The county sheriff called it in as possible animal remains, but the pathologist, who was old enough to remember the story whispered by her grandmother, simply said, "No, it's them." Within days, the quiet town of Darmond, population barely 2,000, found itself awash in journalists, forensic tents, and national curiosity. They called it a mass grave at first, then a site of interest, and finally, haltingly, they began calling it by the name that old folks muttered under their breath for generations: the Sunday School Vanishing. 50 children, all aged between 6 and 12, gone from St. Matthew's Lutheran Mission on the morning of April 14th, 1929. No bodies recovered, no arrests made, no memorials sanctioned by the church. For nearly 100 years, the town learned to live with an undeclared horror, one that history politely forgot. But now, with bones reborn into sunlight, the forgotten had returned. And so began the excavation, not just of earthly remains, but of secrets that had been buried deeper still. A priest's diary sealed inside a hollowed-out Bible, a ledger of payments to names connected to the largest banking families in Des Moines, and a photograph showing the children lined neatly on the mission steps, each wearing the same paper tag on their collars. Numbers, not names. 50 children who never came home from Sunday school, a single surviving teacher who vanished a week later, and a community that swore, as one, never to speak of what was found in the basement chapel that day. Before we continue with the story of the 50 children who vanished from St. Matthew's Mission, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. At the time of the disappearances, America was trembling on the edge of calamity. The spring of 1929 carried an almost cinematic brightness, the high gloss and optimism of the jazz age still playing its tune, the church bells ringing above streets that buzzed with motorcars and gossip about new movie palaces opening in the cities. But beneath that rhythm, cracks were spreading. In the farmlands of Iowa, struggle was already written across the faces of men who worked the soil. Years of overproduction after the Great War had flooded grain markets, and prices had sunk so low that entire families were losing the farms their grandfathers had carved out of the prairie. No one yet spoke the word depression, but everyone felt it ghosting their barns at night. Darmond was little more than a smudge of buildings surrounded by the restless green sea of cornfields. At its center stood St. Matthew's Lutheran Mission, a hulking brick structure that doubled as both church and schoolhouse. Its steeple, blackened by smoke from the foundry across the road, pointed not so much to heaven as into some bruised region of sky where promises and prayers evaporated together. Sunday mornings smelled of starch and lye soap, of pennies dropped into brass collection plates, of hymnals cracked open by small, trembling hands. The missions program for children had been the pride of Pastor Wilhelm Goetz, a man who spoke less like a Midwestern preacher and more like an Old Testament herald. He had come from Bavaria in 1901, bringing with him a zeal that terrified some of his congregation and enthralled others. Under his guidance, the mission trained its children not only in scripture but in moral purity through ritual obedience. Locals whispered that Pastor Goetz expected them to fast, to recite prayers in near darkness, and to confess to temptations of corruption they could not yet comprehend. But parents said nothing. To question a pastor in those days was to question one's salvation. And so the children walked each Sunday in orderly lines from the mill road to the mission steps. 50 of them, dressed in white cotton dresses and little woolen jackets that their mother brushed clean the night before. Sunday school began at 8 sharp, the great bell tolling through the fog. By 10, they were gone. No witnesses claimed to have seen them leave the chapel. No one heard screams. The pastor, who lived in the parsonage next door, stated that he had stepped out to address an urgent telegram and returned to find the children missing, and the supervising teacher, Miss Ida Capel, unaccounted for. Inside, the benches stood neatly arranged. A single hymn lay open on the lectern, bringing in the sheaves. When the sheriff's men arrived, they found footprints leading down to the basement hall where the catechism classes were held. And there, as recalled in testimony taken from the original case file, was an odor of stagnant water and lamp oil. Nothing more, no blood, no sign of forced entry. For the first week, the town searched. Farmers turned their fields into grids of volunteers carrying lanterns. The mine shafts outside of town were lowered by rope. The river was dredged. The county issued posters. But as days turned into weeks, a silence fell. The governor's office issued a statement urging the community not to succumb to hysteria. Most of the parents were issued small bursaries to relocate or find suitable work elsewhere. Within months, half the families were gone. Then the mission closed. The doors were chained, the steeple bell removed. By winter, the building was boarded up and the church records quietly transferred to diocesan custody in Cedar Rapids. None were ever released. But Darman never rid itself of the story. Children growing up in the 1940s whispered dares to peek through the broken chapel windows. Teenagers swore they could hear singing there on foggy nights. Sometimes the black river running behind it seemed to glimmer faintly with candlelight, so the locals said, and even devout mothers preferred to take their evening walks elsewhere. Stone and Wood remember, even when people don't. When the Great Depression hit later that same year, many towns vanished entirely, from drought or bankruptcy, swallowed by time. But Darmond persisted, small and stubborn, a name on the highway sign that only truckers read aloud to pass the time. By the 1960s, the story of the missing 50 had become a kind of morbid folklore, a local myth told to keep children from straying too far from home. It wasn't until 1994, when a failed developer bought the grounds and began excavation for a housing tract, that the census discrepancy was rediscovered in old county papers. 50 minors declared displaced, yet never transferred to any known orphanage. And now, with bones surfacing and the earth giving back what it devoured, the tale demanded daylight. Historians who later examined parish archives uncovered peculiar irregularities. Between 1928 and 1929, St. Matthew's financial ledgers showed large anonymous donations, each marked simply as Mission Purity Fund. In March of 29, a new cellar room was constructed beneath the sanctuary, listed as Ritual Hall. No records of services held there exist. Old photographs show the town as it was, wide avenues dusted with limestone grit, horses still tied to hitching posts outside the grocer's, a faint hum of phonographs playing dance tunes from Des Moines. And amid all that normalcy, St. Matthew's loomed, windows opaque, cross crooked atop its steeple, its bricks charged with that peculiar melancholy of Midwestern religious architecture, beauty too severe to be comforting. This was not urban sin. This was rural piety turned obsessive. An age of revivals and moral crusades, when charismatic preachers crisscrossed the country, promising salvation with one hand and demanding blind surrender with the other. Across Iowa, itinerant zealots filled tents with trembling farmers desperate for meaning after the Great War. Religious movements overlapped with socialist reform clubs, temperance leagues, and apocalyptic sects, predicting America's punishment for its decadence. Darmond was not immune. The church and the school were the twin hearts of small-town life, and questioning either was unthinkable. That gave St. Matthew's an absolute power over its children, a power that would soon curdle into something unspeakable. In spring 1929, strange letters began arriving at surrounding parishes. Each bore Pastor Getz's seal, inviting neighboring clergy to a holy convocation of the innocent. Few had time to attend, harvest season looming, but those who read the invitation later recalled its unsettling language. An appeal for a covenant of cleansing before the Black Flood. And on the morning of April 14th, the Black Flood came quietly. The youngest of the missing was 6-year-old Rose Dittmar, known for her habit of collecting dandelions to hand to the pastor each week. The oldest was 12-year-old Charlie Bedecker, a lanky farm boy who dreamed of seeing the Pacific Ocean. Their mothers prepared them for Sunday school as always, combing hair with kerosene, scrubbing under nails until the skin shone pink, tying ribbons. None imagined it was the last time their hands would touch those small, living heads. Witnesses remembered that day's weather as strangely still. The air had a heavy sweetness to it, the scent of lilac hanging low across the field. Children marched up the gravel road singing their morning hymn. Then the bell of St. Matthew's rang 10 times, and never again. That sound, locals later swore, was wrong somehow. Not the clear peal of bronze, but a muffled, distant toll, as if struck from underground. What happened in that basement hall between those tolls has been the subject of competing legends for a century. Abduction, cult ceremony, human trafficking, even divine retribution. The truth, as the bones begin to whisper, may be more disturbing precisely because it was orchestrated by ordinary people, men and women who prayed, baked supper bread, balanced their ledgers, and built the scaffold of trust on which every small-town congregation rests. When the excavation at Darmond concluded in 2019, forensic teams confirmed that at least 49 distinct juvenile remains were present. Cause of death, undetermined. But residue analysis detected soot, candle wax, and, most curious of all, a chalk powder containing trace mercury and myrrh. Ritual materials, according to one expert. A cleansing compound, according to another. The parish's headstone remains untouched at the local cemetery, a great pillar of gray granite engraved simply, "In faith we are not lost." Yet the question remains, faith in what? To answer that, we must step back into that final innocent spring, into the prayer-soaked air of 1920s Middle America, where righteousness became a mask and every door hid a shadow. They say the dead remember faces better than the living. If that's true, then the faces remembered by the soil of Darmond must be these. The first is Pastor Wilhelm Gutz, the man whose name would come to haunt every yellowed news clipping and whispered conversation over the decades that followed. Photographs show him as tall, rail-thin, and severe. His collar always perfectly straight, his eyes deep and unreadable behind round spectacles. Born near Augsburg in 1878, Gutz had been ordained in the last years of the German Empire, a time when theology still wrestled openly with mysticism. He studied Luther, certainly, but also the early church fathers, the old heretical mystics who believed faith was proven only through suffering. When he came to America at 23, he brought with him a deep certainty that the New World was not the land of freedom it proclaimed to be, but a place of temptation disguised as prosperity. Parishioners said he preached like a man at war with unseen enemies. Satan's kingdom is not fire and pitchforks, he'd thunder, but comfort and laughter and the cracking of bread before grace is spoken. His wife, Annalise, died 2 winters after their arrival. Influenza, they said. After that, Getz seemed to fray at the edges of ordinary life. One of his surviving congregation members, interviewed decades later, recalled a night service in 1928 when Getz had the children stand in 2 rows facing one another while he read from the book of Daniel. "Children," he said softly, "would you cross the furnace if you believed the angel would come?" A little girl asked, "Will it hurt, Pastor?" Getz smiled thinly. "Of course, my dear, but only the part the Lord does not need." He was never accused of hurting any child directly, though there were stories of long confessions behind closed doors, of children returning home with red eyes and hands stained with what parents assumed was chalk dust from the Sunday school slates. His sermons grew darker, his metaphors stranger. Parishioners noted that toward the end, his voice would tremble as though under some private burden. One diary from a parish councilman reads, "The pastor has begun to call the children the lambs of the covenant, and speaks of a trial that will separate weak from worthy. He frightens even the elders now." Yet he was no uneducated zealot. Getz kept an immaculate library, volumes in Latin, German, and Hebrew, each margin packed with notes written in a narrow, precise hand. When investigators finally entered that house almost a year after the disappearance, they found the book still there, except for the Bible. Only its shadow remained on the shelf, the wood darker where it had rested. Then there was Miss Ida Capel, the missing teacher, the gentle soul most townsfolk remembered only as Miss Ida. She was 28 when the Sunday school vanishing occurred, a slight woman with pale hair, usually coiled into a bun that trembled loose by midday. She had come from Sioux City, responding to a humble advertisement for an assistant at St. Matthew's Mission School. What almost no one realized was that she had once trained as a nurse at Mercy Hospital, tending to shell-shocked soldiers returning from France. Her students adored her. Rose Ditmar's mother once recounted how Ida would crouch to eye level with each child and speak to them as if addressing grown souls. "Now, Thomas, the alphabet is a ladder. We climb one letter at a time. If we skip a rung, we fall and hurt our understanding." Even Pastor Getz spoke of her as a vessel of quiet discipline. Yet, privately, he seemed wary of her. Parish accounts suggest repeated disagreements, minor at first, over punishment, prayer routines, and the strange purity circles Getz insisted the children attend in the church basement. One evening in March 1929, just weeks before the vanishing, the pastor and Miss Capel were overheard in heated dispute. "The parents are uneasy," she said. "You're asking too much fasting of them." "You think hunger is cruelty," he replied. "Then you do not understand grace. Grace is what begins when the body fails." When she threatened to report his practices to the diocese, he is said to have smiled and told her, "No one there listens anymore. They are deafened by their own indulgence." The next week, she wrote a letter, never mailed, found later among her effects. "There is something here beneath the church, something he believes holy. God help him if it is." Ada's lodging was a narrow room above the baker's shop across Main Street, and her only known relative was a brother working as a telegraph operator in St. Paul. After the children's disappearance, when the parsonage was found empty, so too was her room. Drawers pulled out, bed untouched, one pair of shoes missing. Her Bible lay open at the Psalms. No one saw her again. Among the victims, a few names lived longest in the local imagination. Children whose laughter once filled the air and whose absence left echoes. Charlie Bedecker, 12, was the oldest. He was a mill worker's son, quick-witted, often in trouble for talking during recitations. His dream, according to his surviving cousin's testimony, was to build a radio powerful enough to reach the ships out at sea. He'd collect spare wire and bits of copper from the junkyard, winding them with ferocious focus. The week before the disappearance, he confided to his cousin, "Pastor says there's a bell in the cellar that only children can hear. Says if we listen right, it will sing to heaven." His cousin remembered answering, half joking, "Then don't listen too close." Charlie smiled. You're just scared of ghosts." His spirit of adventure likely made him the leader among the younger ones that April morning. When they lined up at the mission door, photographs show Charlie at the end of the row, chin lifted, a defiant tilt in his grin, as if he knew he would not follow the rules that day. And yet he did. Then came quiet Rose Dittmar, the youngest. 6 years old, curls like spun straw, perpetually clutching a rag doll she called Agnes. Her father worked the telegraph office. Her mother kept the parson's linens. On Sundays, Rose was known for slipping tiny wildflowers under the hymnals when adults weren't looking. "So the angels have something nice to smell," she'd whisper. On the morning she vanished, her mother recalled Rose humming a tune as she buttoned her dress. "What song is that?" she asked. "Pastor taught us," Rose said. "The one that makes the floor light come." Her mother assumed she meant candle hymns. She would think of that phrase, floor light, for the rest of her days. There are others. Anna Pfaltz, the shy daughter of a dairy farmer who wrote her name twice in the class Bible because, she said, "once for God, once for me." Little twins Nicholas and Niels Jorgensen, who could imitate barn owls so perfectly, the other children begged them to stop. They were last seen playing by the creek with a scrap of wax paper, pretending it was angel wings. 50 children with such ordinary joys, an odd count, more than usual for a single parish class. Records later showed that families from nearby hamlets had been encouraged by Pastor Goetz to send their children for special instruction. The same handwriting in May appears on all the invitation letters. The dates, the ink, the phrasing, identical. He wanted precisely 50. And then there was Sheriff Abel Bristow, the man left to make sense of what remained. Bristow had once been a railroad detective, slow to anger, heavy in the frame, and allergic to nonsense. He had no taste for church matters, but when the state summoned him, he came. Years later, his notes would read more like the diary of a man losing faith in his own senses. In a recorded statement dated May 3, 1929, he wrote, "The pastor declares ignorance. The basement door bears no sign of lock tampering. However, there is a faint pattern of scuff marks in circular formation upon the floor, as if many small feet turned around the same point. I cannot explain it." He interrogated Goetz 3 times. Each ended the same way, with scripture. "Sheriff," Goetz told him, "you look for the missing among the living. The Lord gathers his own where man cannot go." Bristow, exhausted, replied, "You think the Lord needs 50 children all at once?" Goetz only smiled. Perhaps he desired one righteous generation to begin again. It was Bristow who noticed the faint residue on the chapel altar, pale yellow dust under the brass cross. The pastor claimed it was incense ash. Bristow had it analyzed by a chemist in Des Moines. The result came back, sulfur and chalk, in proportions consistent with primitive pigment, an old artist's ochre. Its purpose, unknown. When the press turned on him for failing to produce answers, Bristow resigned, retreated to a cabin north of the county line, and refused interviews until his death. Visitors in later years described his walls lined with newspaper clippings, each stamped with a single word written in thick black marker, "Why?" Finally, the town itself stands as a kind of collective character in the story, a living organism of fear and faith, guilt and forgetting. Dartmouth schoolteacher Hazel Price once wrote that the people of Darmont walked with the politeness of mourners even when they laughed. They tended their gardens, held socials, refurbished their storefronts, all gestures against an unspoken rot. They continued baptisms, weddings, funerals, but none at St. Matthew's. The building became a place nobody owned, yet everyone feared. Teenagers would drive past and honk, perhaps hoping to wake the ghosts into admitting themselves. One old farmer who tended land behind the church through the 1940s told his grandson, "At night I hear them sing. The tune's wrong, like when a wind-up toy runs down. but its children sure as thunder. They want somebody to remember their names. That grandson, decades later, would be the one to notify the sheriff when the backhoe uncovered the bundle of bones. By then, he was an old man himself, the last thread connecting the living to that vanished class. He told reporters, "My granddaddy said the preacher didn't go mad. He just found something in the dark he thought was God, but God maybe wasn't ready to be found." Each of these lives, Getz the zealot, Ida the reluctant disciple, Charlie the bright-eyed inventor, Rose the innocent dreamer, and Abel Bristow the weary seeker, forms a part of the great machine that whirred into motion that spring. A machine built of conviction, secrecy, faith, and fear. Once primed, it could not stop until 50 lives were swallowed by its gears. And now, with their remains laid bare, we can begin to trace how that machine began to turn, one strange and quiet sign at a time, until the day the world realized something was terribly wrong at St. Matthew's Mission. The first sign came with the smell of burned oil. In February of 1929, just weeks before the vanishing, several parishioners arriving early for dawn service found a greasy smoke rising from the grate behind the mission school. The furnace was not yet lit for the day, ashes still cold. A deacon lifted the iron lid and found the source, wadded scraps of rough paper, blackened but still legible at the edges. They bore writing in Pastor Getz's hand. Scriptural verses altered, phrases underlined twice. One repeated line stopped the readers cold. "The wheat shall not rot with the chaff, but be torn from it in the fire." When they showed the scraps to Getz later that morning as he walked into the sacristy, he barely looked up. "Old notes," he said. One of the deacons pressed, "Why burn scripture, Pastor?" Getz's eyes lingered on the man. "Because the word lives longer in smoke." That should have been warning enough. But it was a God-fearing town. They believed in correction, not confrontation. The deacon folded the charred pages, replaced the metal grate, and said no more. That night, the furnace burned again, though no one lit it. Soon after, small, unexplainable things began happening. Candles left in the basement chapel were found melted into puddles, though they had not been used. Drawers in the vestry stood open to reveal only dust, as if hands had rummaged through hundreds of invisible items. And the bell rope in the steeple, which had hung untouched since Christmas, was discovered frayed as though sawn halfway through. The church sexton, old Ezra Pratt, told sheriff deputies later that he'd begun hearing faint noises below the floorboards during the pastor's evening prayers, soft movements, like children whispering a memory together. When he mentioned this to Getz, the pastor frowned. "You mustn't listen," he said. "There are things that echo holiness too loudly for mortal ears." Already the congregation had begun shrinking. The children, according to their parents, came home from Sunday class strangely subdued. They spoke of tests and the rooms below. When asked who mentioned them, they'd answer only, "The pastor's bell." One mother, Susanna Pohl, a widow with 2 children among the 50, found chalk symbols drawn on her front doorstep one morning, 2 intersecting circles and a smaller one in the center. She scrubbed them away. By evening they had reappeared, clearer this time, carved into the wood by a sharp blade. She went to Getz, trembling with the cutting board still in her hand. "Sir," she said, "is this scripture or wickedness?" He looked at the mark, his expression unreadable. "It is the sign of the covenant," he said at last, "a promise that your children are chosen." Susanna went home shaking. That night she locked her children indoors. By dawn the carvings had appeared on the inside of her window frames. Miss Ida Capel kept a journal, her handwriting careful, rounded, chapters of unease growing like mold. The entries begin ordinary, lessons planned, illness among pupils, prayers for weather fair enough for the spring pageant, but by March, the tone changes. March 1st. Pastor asked today that I dismiss the younger children early Friday. He wishes to hold a ceremony for the older group. He says it is to commemorate the annunciation of the new covenant. I told him Easter is weeks away. He only smiled. March 8th. He's taken to locking the cellar. I have heard singing down there after dark. It frightens me because the voices sound strained, not joyful. Still, when I asked, he said the children rehearsed hymns. I can see their lips pale from fasting. March 15th. They are not learning anymore. They are rehearsing something I do not understand. Her final note came the Saturday before it all ended. If they know what waits for them, they hide it well. Tomorrow I will open that door whether he forbids or not. She never wrote again. Neighbors began whispering of lights within the mission after midnight, thin gold glimmers bleeding between the planks of boarded cellar windows. Sometimes people swore they saw shadows moving below the glass, like candle processionals marching in circles. Many dismissed these things as fevered talk in hard times. Yet something in the town's air shifted. Dogs howled without cause. Hens refused to lay. On cloudless nights, a low hum seemed to rise from underground, tremulous as a harmonium played through the earth. It was around this time that Sheriff Bristow was first called, not for missing children, but for trespass. The baker, Mrs. Koenig, awoke one night to find footprints of bare feet across the floor lining her shop's wooden floor. Small feet, hundreds of them, all leading toward the churchyard and disappearing under the mission fence. The next morning she showed them to Bristow, who tried to laugh it off. "Probably strays from the poorhouse," he said. "Kids wander at night." Mrs. Koenig pointed to one print clear as glass in the flour. 5 small toes, but no heel. The mark ended abruptly, as though the foot had melted into air. He said he'd patrol that road himself the next night. He did. Nothing stirred, though he wrote later that between 2 and 3 in the morning, a sound like singing drifted faintly from the church gate. A soft child chorus, moving in cadence with no melody I recognized. By Palm Sunday, superstition had edged into panic. Ida was uneasy. She'd gone to 3 parents privately, warning them to keep their little ones home that Easter. One father, a man named Bedecker, rebuked her. "If you spread talk against the pulpit, you undo what faith we got left." For all his doubts, even he sent Charlie that next week. And Charlie, bright, curious Charlie, made his last earthly invention in those days. A small crystal earphone cobbled from wire and a magnet. His cousin found it later on his windowsill, attached to nothing. On its fragile coil, someone had etched tiny words with a pin. "If the bell rings twice, don't come." No one heard the bell ring twice. None who lived, anyway. And yet, amid growing fear, some said there was reason to rejoice. Parish bulletins of early April recorded a miraculous event. Lines of script printed in ornate type announced, "Hearts of the children have been purified. Soon they shall ascend to the greater household of faith." No one entirely understood, yet none wanted to appear skeptical. This was rural piety. You kept quiet. You bowed to authority. You prayed things away. When Miss Capel failed to attend the parish council on April 11th, Getz explained from the pulpit that she had undertaken private meditation. Nobody asked where. But small hints of dread continued to leak into town. The blacksmith found his Bible outside the smithy door, every page blank. The words sweat-faded as though licked away. 2 mothers claimed the creek behind their farms ran briefly red at sunset, though that claim was never officially recorded. And still the church bell hung silent, heavy as the unspoken. By the eve of April 14th, rain clouds gathered but never broke. Getz was seen walking from house to house near twilight, placing envelopes beneath doorways. Inside each, a single pressed flower, a lily, and a slip of parchment reading, "Blessed are those who hear the call and come." He never explained its meaning. That night, the last person to speak with him was old Sexton Pratt. According to later testimony, Pratt entered the church around 11 to remove dying lilies from the altar. He found Goetz kneeling before the chancel rail, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "Pastor," Pratt whispered, "it's late." Goetz did not rise. "Do you hear it, Ezra?" "Hear what?" "The river under the floor." "There's no river." But Goetz smiled faintly. "You will, just before dawn." Pratt left him there. He would wake to the sound of the 10 bell tolls and never again see the man alive. Looking back through those last weeks feels like watching a shadow form around a candle. Light still present, but shrinking, the darkness closing in. The townsfolk of Darmond went about their days, uneasy, clutching sermons tighter, whispering to each other yet taking no action. The pastor's authority was total, his aura of divine certainty even stronger when he became erratic. Some pitied him, others feared him, none defied him. That combination, pity, fear, obedience, is the recipe for tragedy. There were stories afterward of villagers dreaming the same thing, a circle of children standing around a dark pit, holding hands, singing in unison. Old men confessed decades later that they had woken that Sunday morning before the bells, hearts pounding, with the same phrase echoing in their minds, "The furnace is ready." Coincidence, maybe, but coincidences have a way of clustering around truth. The town forged forward blindly into Easter week, each family clinging to its rituals of polish and prayer. They didn't know that below the mission floorboards, a final set of candles had already been placed, forming their peculiar mark of crossing circles, the sign of covenant Goetz had spoken of. He had prepared it meticulously. And somewhere in her journal, Miss Ida had written her last resolute words, "I will open that door." Whether she did, and what she found in that basement, the records will never entirely reveal. But all signs suggest that by the time the sunrise touched Darmond that April morning, horror was already awake, listening to the bell rope sway faintly overhead, waiting for its toll. And thus, as sheets of rain threatened but never fell, as children quietly slept in their beds dreaming of the next day's lesson, the last fragile calm settled over the town, one so serene that even the crickets seemed ashamed to speak. When the bell finally rang, 10 times exactly, it was said no one could tell from which direction the sound came, down from heaven, up from hell, or, most dreadfully of all, beneath their very own feet. By the evening of April 14th, the sun had gone down behind a bank of slate-colored storm clouds. It was the time between light and dark, when the roads became pale ribbons and chimney smoke hovered low, unsure whether to rise or settle. That hour, the people of Darmond began realizing their children were not coming home. At first, it passed as simple delay. The Sunday school sessions often ran long when the pastor held extra prayer. Parents, dressed in their modest Sunday clothes, lingered by the gates, muttering polite conversation. "He likes to make them sing the closing hymn twice," one father said, checking his watch. But as the church windows darkened and rain began to speckle the gravel, unease replaced patience. One mother, Susanna Pohl, knocked repeatedly upon the heavy door. The echo was strange, no hollow answering sound, just the muffled thud of something thick behind the wood. She turned to the sexton, Ezra Pratt, who was fumbling with his keys. "Where are they, Ezra?" she demanded. Perhaps in the lower room," he stammered. "Pastor's likely finishing the lesson." "Then open it." When Pratt finally slid the iron key home and drew the bolt, a smell of soot and damp stone breathed out from within. The candles in the vestibule still burned. The pews were neatly aligned, hymnals in their proper slots. But no children filled the benches and no voice led them in song. The air hung with that awful stillness of places from which life has only recently departed. They searched the upper rooms first, the dormitory, the classroom, the small chamber Ida Capel used for lessons. Her shawl still hung on its peg. Her chalk drawings filled the blackboard, a crude sketch of angels blowing trumpets. And there, across the center board, written in neat block letters, the children's last known lesson: When the Master Comes. The basement door stood at the back behind the pulpit, half concealed by a curtain. When Pratt pulled it aside, the stairway beneath seemed to absorb light instead of catching it. The first lantern down revealed nothing remarkable, just the cold flagstone floor and the smell of clove oil. Yet the further they descended, the stronger that scent grew, until several men gagged on the thickness of it. The cellar chamber that appeared at the bottom was circular, thick limestone walls, ceiling low as a root cellar. In the middle, a ring had been scorched into the floor in perfect symmetry, 3 feet across. Upon that black circle they found 50 small paper tags, each printed with a single number in red ink. They were pinned to the floorboards with nails, as though marking spaces once occupied. No blood, no footprints leading away. Just the circle, the scent, and the ringing silence which many said hummed faintly, like a note barely held in an empty bottle. The moment those things were seen, fear spread through the church like contagion. Some women fainted outright. Others screamed the names of their children into the echoing stairwell. Pratt muttered over and over, shaking his lantern, "They're not here. They'll come back. They must." Sheriff Bristow was summoned before midnight. Rain lashed the roads. His motor car nearly drowned in the muddy ruts, but by 1 a.m. he stood within that basement room. He would describe later the heat. Though the air was cold, he felt a warmth rising from the blackened circle, as if the stones had swallowed fire still smoldering below. The investigation began in earnest the next morning. The courthouse filled with weeping families, and Bristow, his long coat soaked through, took statements by the dozen. Each nightmare that poured from their mouths added weight to the impossible. "My Rose was wearing her new shoes," said a mother. "She'd never run off. My boy Charlie knew how to track deer. If he were in those woods, I'd find him." By day 2, news had reached Des Moines. Reporters arrived by train, some hoping for a miracle story, others for a scandal. Rumors flared like brush fire, the children taken for ransom, hidden by bootleggers, victims of highway bandits. But none of those theories explained the church's sinister stillness or why the pastor had vanished. Yes, Getz was gone. When deputies entered his parsonage beside the mission, they found his supper untouched on the table, the lamp still burning. On the chair by the window hung his heavy wool coat, still damp from the day's earlier rain. He had walked out wearing his collar and carried only the Bible, leaving everything else behind. The last to see him was an old farmer traveling east along the river road around daybreak. He was walking steady, the man claimed, not like someone escaping, just walking with his head bowed and that book cradled in his arms like a baby. Search parties combed the riverbanks, anticipating a body. They found none. By Wednesday morning, the governor directed state police to take charge. Bristow, demoted to liaison under the uniformed outsiders, showed them everything: the spare classrooms, the cellar, even Getz's desk in which they discovered strange documents. Among them, a bound folio titled Catechism of the New Covenant, 20 handwritten pages describing a purification through the chosen lambs, whose souls shall illuminate the furnace of rebirth. It cited scripture but twisted it. Passages from Leviticus mingled with invented verses about the calling of the 50. The state investigator, a sharp-nosed man named Hardin, slammed the folder shut. It's either a madman's poetry or proof of the worst crime this county's ever seen. Bristow could only nod. Within days, the town divided into two camps. The older residents insisted the children had been taken, perhaps trafficked across state lines. Others believed every last one lay dead beneath the church, swallowed by some unspeakable ritual. In the cafes and at the feed store, arguments broke into shoving matches. "You call it murder," some muttered. "I call it judgment." The newspapers ran headlines. Mass abduction baffles authorities. Dark rites feared in Iowa mission. By the first Sunday after the event, hundreds of pilgrims flocked to Darmond. Some brought candles, setting them near the locked church door. A few fell to their knees, convinced they stood on sanctified ground. The mothers screamed at them to stop, throwing rocks until police intervened. The parish bishop arrived from Cedar Rapids, promising full cooperation. But his statement to press, a measured, polished recitation, only deepened suspicion. "We cannot confirm any wrongdoing beyond human error and panic. The Lord's ways, though painful, will reveal mercy in time." Mercy never came. As the weeks crawled by, investigations multiplied. Divers dredged the river. Bloodhounds searched the grain silos. Reporters printed and retracted wild theories almost daily. The words cult and sacrifice began whispering from radios and newspapers, though censors tried to contain them. One clue emerged when a deputy discovered behind the altar a loose brick concealing a small wooden box. Inside, a withered lily, its petals coated with powder identical to the substance from the basement circle. Chemical tests found mercury traces. Scholars from the university speculated it was an archaic preservative aid used in illumination rites, a term from apocryphal monastic texts describing rituals of false resurrection. That detail never made it to print. The files were quietly stamped confidential. Among the families, grief ate in waves. Many moved away. Those who stayed turned their sorrow inward, fasting, repenting, refusing music. The playground behind the abandoned mission stayed untouched, swings stiff with rust. Through summer into autumn, the case seemed to bleed out like an old wound. Then, new horror, letters began arriving. They came postmarked from cities across the Midwest, some addressed to local families, others to the sheriff himself. Each envelope contained a child's drawing, simple pencil scrawls on brown paper. The style was unmistakably childish, yet the images were troubling. Circles of children holding hands around a black sun, many bearing numbers on their chests. On the back of each sheet, scrawled in the same hand, "Do not look for us, we hear the furnace song." Handwriting experts deemed it imitative. Reporters speculated hoax. But one of the letters to the Ditmar home enclosed a fragment of white lace cut from a dress, identified by the mother instantly. "That was Rose's hem," she sobbed. How such a fragment could travel through the mail system from another state without detection remains unrecorded. By that winter, public fascination waned. The Great Depression struck. Attention turned to bread lines and bank collapses. But for Sheriff Bristow, the case consumed what remained of his peace. He spent nights under the stars by the river, scanning reflections for the smallest shimmer of candles. His final field entry, dated December 12th, reads, "The soil before the altar has sunk by 2 inches, though the foundation below shows no fracture. It is as if something hollowed from beneath, breathing still." Whether exhaustion or madness drove that observation, no one can say. Decades passed, and memory itself became divided between official records that called it an unresolved child disappearance, and locals who cursed the mission ground as cursed in itself. Children born long after were warned not to play near its gates. After every heavy rain, puddles formed in the exact pattern of that scorched circle, refusing to dry as fast as the surrounding ground. small, stagnant mirrors reflecting the steeple cross like a wound reopening. In 1953, when a lightning strike gutted part of the old roof, the rebuilding crew found another hidden compartment behind the choir loft. Inside, dozens of children's shoes, arranged by size, their leather impossibly preserved, each with a tag bearing a number from 1 to 50. The church officials tried again to explain. Of a misplaced charity collection, they said, forgotten after the tragedy. Yet those who'd seen the nails holding the tags knew no one simply forgot. It was around this time that amateur researchers began exploring occult parallels. How Guts's writings resembled fragments of early mystical sects that preached the purification of innocence to hasten the kingdom. Papers began circulating in theology departments, most quietly retracted once the church lawyers intervened. But the seed of suspicion had sprouted. Whole conferences debated whether Getz believed himself prophet or martyr, whether the children's ascension had been symbolic or else unspeakably literal. The more scholars probed, the deeper the silence from official channels became. One academic, Dr. Harold Lentz of Chicago Theological Seminary, filed a letter with the State Archive in 1971, noting that Gutz's so-called Catechism of the New Covenant contained not merely theological ramblings, but coded instructions, patterns corresponding to planetary alignments of April 1929. He concluded dryly, either deliberate symbolism or, more likely, schedule for ritual observance. His findings were never published. Lenz drowned in the Iowa River 3 months later. By the time the grave was rediscovered in 2019, the past had decayed into legend. Yet, once again, the name Gutz returned to headlines. Families who moved away generations earlier received calls from journalists asking for heirlooms, diaries, any surviving relics. And slowly, the story surfaced. Letters, second-hand memories of that week of vanished light. Testimonies from grandchildren who'd listened to their elders whisper names they weren't supposed to remember. One elderly woman, 97, who claimed to have been too sick to attend Sunday school that morning, told investigators from her nursing bed, "I woke when the bell rang. It sounded from the ground up, not the sky. Mama ran out screaming. The whole town stood in the street looking at the church. Then a wind came through like a sigh, and the steeple cross bent sideways. Nobody fixed it right again." That image, the twisted cross, became the single lasting emblem of Darman's guilt. It still leans today, slanting toward the cemetery where the new memorial now stands, though locals insist every attempt to straighten it fails by morning. If the human mind demands closure, the story of the 50 denies it like stubborn ground refusing to yield seed. Even with bones in boxes and archives unsealed, the true machinery of faith and madness that turned beneath St. Matthew's remains partly buried. So we stand, as they once did, between fear and curiosity, between crime and sacrament, between the living and what the living choose to forget. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Long after the dust of investigation had settled and the living world tried to return to its routines, one last trove of evidence surfaced, the kind that strips away myth and replaces it with something colder. In 1989, a demolition order was issued for the parsonage beside St. Matthew's. Before the walls came down, construction workers cataloged the contents of the cellar. Behind a false panel, the same type of stone used to frame the church's altar, they found a narrow shaft leading even deeper. It spiraled into a crypt that no record had ever mentioned. Down there, the air was thick with lime. Embedded in the western wall, sealed behind a glass front, lay a box of blackened vellum pages bound with wire. On the cover, a single Latin inscription read, "Verbum quod lucet in tenebris," the word that shines in darkness. When historians translated the contents years later, they realized it was Wilhelm Gutz's private diary, kept from 1927 through the week of the vanishing. It was not the ranting of a madman as many expected. Its tone was measured, scholarly, and fatally sincere. March 2nd, 1929. The old catechisms have failed them. They pray, but they do not see. The covenant requires not belief but offering. In the innocence of the young lies the spark that may yet reignite this weary world. March 30th. Ida resists. She thinks the furnace symbol mere allegory. She will understand when the tone descends. I have heard it now twice beneath the chapel. Deep sea, sustained beyond breath. It is not the organ. It is calling. April 13th. Tomorrow at dawn the lambs will stand within the ring. The world above will forget, but heaven counts none lost. The next page ends mid-sentence, ink pooled like a stopped pulse. That discovery drew scholars, priests, and opportunists back into Darmond. Forensic architects re-examined the original basement floor and realized the scorched circle was not paint at all, but a mineral crust fused by extreme heat from below. Core sampling revealed that the limestone beneath the church had buckled inward as though exposed to sudden combustion. Yet there was no hearth, no vent, no trace of equipment capable of such burn. The engineers could give only a tired shrug. Ground gases, maybe lightning strike, perhaps chemical seepage. Anything but what the pages implied, that at some hour before sunrise, fire had indeed blossomed within holy ground. A retired deacon, half-deaf and scarcely coherent, broke silence soon after. On a stormy April night in 1930, he had returned alone to the locked church to retrieve personal papers. What he found, he never told police, but confided to his confessor decades later. The priest kept a record. The deacon reported hearing low chanting from beneath the floor and perceived a tremor in the air, like many small voices humming a single note. He opened the basement door and saw light seeping through every crack in the stone. Fearing explosion, he fled. When he looked back from the yard, he beheld, he said, figures of children standing at the windows, faces white as wax candles, mouths moving silently. There was no sound. Hallucination? Grief? Or memory repeating itself through an overtaxed mind? Yet when investigators re-entered the derelict structure after his death, they found glass panes inside each basement window streaked with handprints, all small and all pressed from the inside. The prints were carbon-dated. They matched the time of the catastrophe. Among theologians, the case provoked bitter division. Official church spokesmen insisted Guts had succumbed to delusion, but fringe clerics whispered of an older doctrine, the belief that the pure could be transfigured through controlled fire, a literal reading of the verse, "The elements shall melt with fervent heat." Few dared speculate aloud that Guts might have sincerely believed he was sparing the children from the corruption to come. That spring of 1929, stock markets were trembling, droughts advancing westward, Europe rearming. Many sermons elsewhere carried the same foreboding tone. The world ending, innocence perishing. Perhaps he thought to save at least a handful, to make of them eternal sparks for a new creation. What happened precisely within that circle is therefore partly known and partly guessed. Autopsies of the exhumed remains showed neither trauma nor gunshot, no poison residue, no fracture stains from weapons. But several bones bore a delicate vitrification, as if briefly glazed by heat beyond 1,000 degrees, hotter than any furnace the mission owned. The rosary beads found among them had melted into a single lump of black glass, fused to the shape of fingers that were no longer there. Forensic physicists could not reconcile that detail. They concluded the event had released instantaneous thermal energy without lasting flame. In plainer words, something had flashed, clean, and then gone. In the autumn following the diary's discovery, the archive released what many consider the final piece of testimony from the era, a sound cylinder found in a cedar box, labeled simply Sunday School Rehearsal. Presumed useless, it was restored and played in the state laboratory. For 30 seconds, nothing, only faint static. Then, behind the hiss, a rising hum, rhythmic, children's voices indistinct, yet perfectly unified. At 0:31, another voice emerged, a man's, calm, resonant, intoning phrases in German. Analysts identified fragments of Psalm 12 mixed with nonsensical syllables, a litany alternating between praise and command. At 1:12, the hum ascended to a pitch painful to hear. Then, abrupt silence, followed by what engineers described as broadband interference resembling thunder recorded from inside the instrument. The cylinder cracked apart during playback. Some swear you can still find digitized fragments online, but official agencies deny it. Those back in Darmond knew little of laboratories or hypotheses. They only felt the unease bleed through every generation afterward. The soil seemed unable to hold crops, water wells soured periodically, and each Easter, even when the church lay in ruins, locals reported faint bells at dawn. Yet one figure among them refused to reduce the horror to myth. Eleanor Bristow, granddaughter of the sheriff, returned to the case as a journalist in the 1990s. She took every surviving file, conducted interviews across 3 states, and published a single small press book titled The 50 and the Fire Beneath. It vanished from shelves under mysterious circumstances, a court order citing unverified defamatory material. Only fragments survived in private collections. From those fragments we know what she claimed, that she'd tracked the route of Wilhelm Goetz's disappearance along the river, finding what appeared to be footprints ending halfway across a shallow ford. Embedded in the mud, she lifted something small, the top plate of a Bible's cover, the gilding half burned away. Tests revealed ash and human calcium. Her conclusion, Goetz had not fled but followed. He'd completed his ritual, entered the same flame, and simply ceased. He fed himself to that light, she wrote. Skeptics, of course, offered easier answers. Toxic gases from old mine seams, a mass hysteria triggered by chemical exposure, the children suffocating within a sealed chamber and later burned clandestinely to conceal negligence. But these explanations always frayed against physical evidence. Where, then, were the tools? Why were the stones underneath glazed like porcelain? Who mailed the drawings years later on stationery predating 1929? Locals who lived through the aftermath still mutter another version, simpler, crueler. They say the Lord finally answered Goetz, only not as he expected. That when he called for new angels, something else listened instead. And it is here that faith and horror blend beyond separation. Because among the buried artifacts unearthed in 2019 was a copper plaque fused to the foundation beam. On its surface, only 3 words were legible, the rest molten away. Lux in Inferno, light in the Inferno. The edges of each letter were cut from within, as if the heat that birthed them came not from fire striking metal, but metal striking fire. Standing in that excavated space today, visitors describe strange sensations. The hum of tinnitus fading out into harmony. The temperature dropping precisely 3 degrees along the ring where the soil still refuses new growth. Tour guides attribute it to imagination, yet they lower their voices all the same. Here is the room where innocence met conviction, and conviction, mistaking itself for God, consumed everything entrusted to it. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. When dawn rose on that first Easter without the 50, the rest of Darmond aged a generation overnight. Women wandered the muddy streets barefoot, their Sunday shoes abandoned where they had fallen in the churchyard. The men, stoic, practical farm men, spoke little. They simply stopped shaking one another's hands. Within a month, the state shuttered St. Matthew's S, nailing timber across the great double doors. The surviving pews went to storage, though some carpenters refused to handle them. Insurance agents called the fire marks natural soil corrosion. The church bell, half melted from whatever heat had come up through its own tower, was taken down and shipped to Des Moines for study. It vanished en route, as if ashamed to be evidence. The national papers lost interest quickly. By autumn, the crash on Wall Street had swallowed every headline. Across America, children were vanishing of another kind, into hunger, into labor, into silence, and the 50 of Darmond joined a longer list the world preferred not to read. Still, the story left imprints deeper than law could measure. Parents who had lost their sons and daughters drifted into sects and pilgrim bands, searching for meaning. One small congregation in Missouri even adopted Guts's twisted rhetoric, preaching that fire refines. They dwindled to nothing in 10 years, though rumors circulated that they built their chapels only of limestone, the stone that remembers heat. In Darmond itself, secrecy ossified into culture. Locals grew politely deaf to questions. Children in the 1950s learned a single rule: do not speak of the mission after sunset. The place acquired its own weather. Fruit trees near the ruins bloomed too early, or not at all. Farmers swore that milk curdled faster in the valley air. Scientists took samples, found nothing special, but the superstition lingered like mildew. Through mid-century, the state maintained a file labeled simply the Getz investigation. Each new attorney general reviewed it, wrote insufficient evidence, and passed it forward. When the Freedom of Information reforms opened it to public view, nearly every page came redacted. Entire paragraphs struck out in black, as though the darkness still insisted on its share. A few voices kept the memory alive. Sheriff Bristow, before his death in 1948, published a short piece in the Iowa Register titled "The Silence of St. Matthew S." In it he confessed regret not for failure of duty, but for failure of belief. Because I doubted the impossible, I left the innocent unguarded. His gravestone bears no badge nor scripture, only the words, "Still listening." Each decade brought an anniversary article, some earnest, some lurid. Television crews arrived in the 1970s, spouting phrases like rural cult mystery, and left disappointed when no ghost appeared on film. Yet, even pulled into media farce, the case unsettled clerics across denominations. Seminaries quietly revised curricula on pastoral authority, citing Darmond without naming it. By the turn of the 21st century, descendants of the victims pressed for a formal memorial. The diocese resisted until new testing of bone fragments confirmed dates beyond dispute. Finally, in 2021, the site was consecrated as the Field of the 50. Granite markers list no names, only numbers, 1 through 50, mirroring the paper tags once found in that black ring. A new generation visits now, guided by curiosity more than grief. They take photographs, leave toys, light votive candles beneath plastic domes. Tourists speak in whispers they do not understand, and docents recite the town-approved version. It was an era of fear, a tragedy of misplaced faith. The line between warning and absolution grows thinner every year. Restoration crews have rebuilt the steeple twice, attempting to straighten it. Both times, during the first thunderstorm of spring, lightning struck the same beam and bent the cross again. Not much, just enough to lean. Engineers offer clean explanations. Metal fatigue, wind shear, coincidence. But the townsfolk still trace its shadow with their eyes as they pass, and if dusk catches them mid-crossing the lane, they quicken their pace. Investigators, theologians, skeptics, all close their files in the end. Yet in the language of folklore, nothing closes. In rural storytelling, the 50 remain walking down that gravel road in bright white, far ahead of the living, still keeping Sunday. Some swear that on cloud-heavy mornings when fog hugs the creek, you can hear their voices counting off the numbers, 1 to 50, then back again, as though they must keep perfect roll until every truth is told. The moral most visitors draw is simple. Guard the ones who trust you absolutely, for their faith is the easiest fire to feed. But the people of Darmond know a different lesson, quieter and harder. They have learned that evil does not always lower its voice or hide behind horns. Sometimes it speaks softly from a pulpit, eyes shining with conviction, and we nod because it sounds like hope. And so Iowa keeps its monument, a field of numbered stones under a tilting cross, open to the wind. The children never came home, but they never fully left either. Their absence rebuilt the world around it. Every sermon preached about humility, every investigation into clerical power, every whispered prayer by parents on Sunday mornings owes a little lineage to the day faith and obedience crossed paths and could not tell each other apart. 80, 90, 100 years on, the earth still holds its silence. The cornfields sway above the buried ring. The cross leans, the bell, half melted, rests in some unmarked crate. Only the wind keeps vigil, humming the same note that once turned prayer into flame. We call what happened in Darmond a tragedy, yet that word feels much too small. Call it a warning written in ash, a reminder that devotion without doubt can burn brighter than reason itself. The 50 children are beyond our reach, but the choice that ended them, blind obedience, walks beside us still, waiting for another pulpit, another promise. So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled or buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story, where another forgotten town learns that faith casts the longest shadow of all.